You never would have guessed what happened at the end of this story, but first, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales that will touch your soul. What would you do if you discovered that a single bark could change not just your life, but the lives of countless others forever? The rain was pounding mercilessly against the metal roof of the Manhattan Animal Shelter on that bitter October morning. I remember pressing my cold nose against the chain-link fence of my kennel, watching droplets cascade down the small window near the ceiling. My name back then was simply K9 Unit 247, another forgotten soul in a sea of abandoned hopes and broken dreams. The shelter was located in the heart of the Lower East Side, where the contrast between luxury high-rises and struggling neighborhoods told stories of two different worlds. I had been there for exactly 847 days, yes, I counted each one, marking them with small scratches in my mind like prisoners do on their cell walls. The volunteers called me the old-timer, though I was barely 4 years old. In shelter time, though, that made me practically ancient. That morning started like any other. Sarah, the young volunteer with kind eyes and a slight limp from a childhood accident, was making her rounds with breakfast. She always snuck me an extra scoop of kibble, whispering that I was her favorite. But there was something different in the air that day, electricity that made my fur stand on end. Through the shelter's front windows, I could see the busy street where yellow cabs splashed through puddles and hurried New Yorkers clutched their umbrellas against the wind. That's when I first saw her, little Emma Thompson, age 8, with her bright red raincoat and light-up sneakers. She was walking with her mother, Catherine, who was busy arguing with someone on her phone about some important meeting she was running late for. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Emma's small hand slipped from her mother's grasp as she spotted a puppy in the shelter window. The traffic light had just turned green, and a black SUV was accelerating through the intersection, its driver distracted by his own phone conversation. Emma stepped off the curb, her mother's scream piercing the air like a siren. I don't remember breaking through the kennel door. The shelter staff later said I somehow managed to hit it with enough force to snap the latch. I don't remember sprinting through the shelter's front door, which Sarah had left slightly ajar while bringing in supplies. What I do remember is the feeling of my muscles coiling like springs, the surge of adrenaline as I launched myself through the air, and the solid impact as I knocked Emma back onto the sidewalk, mere inches from the SUV's wheels. The vehicle's brakes squealed against the wet pavement, and time seemed to freeze. The driver, a tall man in an expensive suit, jumped out of the car, his face as white as fresh snow. Catherine Thompson was already wrapping her arms around Emma, tears mixing with the rain on her face. And there I stood, soaked to the bone, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. But it wasn't just any man who stepped out of that SUV. It was Robert Maxwell, the tech billionaire whose face had graced the cover of Time magazine just last month. The man who had revolutionized artificial intelligence and owned half of Silicon Valley. The man who, I would soon learn, had lost his own daughter in a similar accident 5 years ago. I expected to be punished for breaking out of the shelter. Instead, Robert Maxwell knelt down in the rain beside me, his $5,000 suit getting soaked in the process. His eyes met mine, and in that moment, something passed between us, a recognition, an understanding. He reached out slowly, his hand trembling slightly, and touched my head. "What's his story?" he asked Sarah, who had run out after me in a panic. "He's been here almost 3 years," she replied, still catching her breath. "Nobody wants an older dog, especially a mixed breed with no papers." Robert Maxwell stood up slowly, pulling out his phone. "Call the board," he said to someone on the other end. "Cancel my meetings for the next month. And get me everything you can find about canine training programs, the best in the world." As he spoke those words, I had no idea that my life was about to change forever. But what happened next would prove to be even more extraordinary than that rainy morning in Manhattan. Because saving Emma wasn't just a random act of heroism, it was the first step in a journey that would lead me from a cold concrete kennel to places I never could have imagined. But before I tell you about the private island and the secrets that would change the medical world forever, you need to understand what happened in those first crucial weeks after the rescue. Because sometimes, the most important changes in our lives come not from the big moments that everyone sees, but from the quiet ones that happen when nobody's watching. And as the black SUV pulled away from the shelter at morning, with me sitting in the back seat on leather softer than any bed I'd ever known, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the window. I was no longer K-9 Unit 247. I was about to become something else entirely. Something that would make headlines around the world and change the lives of countless people. But that's not even the most incredible part of this story. The Maxwell estate sprawled across 50 acres in the Hamptons, a fortress of modern architecture and old-world grandeur where floor-to-ceiling windows faced the Atlantic Ocean. As we pulled through the gates that first evening, I couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between my old chain-link kennel and the manicured gardens that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. "Welcome to your new home, buddy," Robert said, his voice soft with an emotion I couldn't quite place. He'd spent the entire car ride making calls, setting things in motion that I wouldn't understand until much later. But there was one call that stood out, a conversation with someone he called Dr. Sarah Chen about genetic markers and extraordinary sensory capabilities. The mansion's foyer could have fit the entire shelter where I'd spent the last 3 years. A woman named Mrs. Peterson, the head housekeeper, stood waiting with a warm towel and what looked like a gourmet meal on a silver platter. "We'll need to give him a proper name," she said, watching as I cautiously sniffed the unfamiliar surroundings. "Atlas," Robert replied without hesitation. "Because he carries the weight of others' lives on his shoulders." There was that emotion again, raw and heavy in his voice. Later that night, I would learn why. In Robert's private study, while thunder rolled across the ocean outside, he showed me a photograph. A little girl with his eyes smiled back from a silver frame, holding a trophy from what appeared to be a science fair. "This was Amy," he said, his fingers tracing the glass. "She was crossing the street after school when..." His voice trailed off, but I understood. I pressed my nose against his hand, and he let out a shaky breath. What happened next would set the course for everything that followed. As Robert wiped his eyes, a strange scent caught my attention. Something wasn't right. The smell was subtle, like ozone before a storm, but wrong somehow. I began pawing at his chest, whining urgently. "What is it, boy?" he asked, but I wouldn't stop. The smell was getting stronger, and every instinct in my body was screaming danger. Finally, Robert called his personal physician, Dr. Matthews, more to humor me than out of real concern. The diagnosis came 3 hours later, a previously undetected arterial blockage that could have caused a fatal heart attack within days. "I've never seen anything like it," Dr. Matthews said, studying my file from the shelter. "Dogs can be trained to detect certain medical conditions, but this level of spontaneous awareness, it's unprecedented." That discovery sparked something in Robert's brilliant mind. Within days, the east wing of the mansion was transformed into a state-of-the-art training facility. Experts from around the world were flown in: Dr. Chen, the renowned geneticist from Stanford, James Cooper, the military's top K-9 trainer, and Dr. Isabella Martinez, a pioneer in animal cognition studies. The training was intense. 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, we worked on honing my natural abilities. They started with simple scent recognition, cancer cells in petri dishes, blood samples with various conditions, even COVID-19 samples, safely contained, of course. But what amazed them wasn't just my ability to detect these conditions, it was the fact that I could identify them before any existing medical test could. "It's like he can smell the future," Dr. Martinez remarked one day, after I'd identified a participant's early-stage Parkinson's disease 3 years before any conventional test would have caught it. The research team called it predictive olfactory diagnosis, POD for short. But even they didn't understand how deep this ability went. One morning, during a routine training session, something unexpected happened. A new research assistant, Tom Wheeler, was running me through scent trials when I suddenly refused to continue. Instead, I began circling him, becoming increasingly agitated. Within hours, Tom was in the emergency room. The diagnosis? A brain aneurysm that would have ruptured within days. News of my abilities began to spread through the medical community, despite Robert's efforts to keep things quiet. Private offers started pouring in, pharmaceutical companies, research institutions, even government agencies. But Robert had different plans, ones that would make my sheltered days seem like ancient history. What none of us knew then was that my abilities were about to be tested in ways none of us could have imagined. Because while we were celebrating our breakthroughs in the Hamptons, something was happening on the other side of the world that would force us to push the boundaries of what we thought was possible. And as I lay in my custom-made bed that night, watching the moonlight dance across the Atlantic, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd barely scratched the surface of what was to come. The scents were getting stronger, the patterns clearer, and somewhere in the back of my mind, a clock was ticking down to a moment that would change everything. But before I tell you about the crisis that would push my abilities to their absolute limit, you need to know about the mysterious visitor who arrived at the mansion exactly 3 months after my training began. Because sometimes, the biggest threats don't announce themselves with sirens and flashing lights, sometimes, they walk right through the front door wearing a friendly smile and carrying secrets that could destroy everything we'd worked for. The sound of helicopter blades cutting through the night sky told me our visitor had arrived. And with them, a scent I'd never encountered before, one that made my first stand on end and my heart race with anticipation. Something was coming, something big, and none of us were ready for what would happen next. The helicopter's blades cut through the misty Hamptons night, slicing the air with a rhythmic thump that set my nerves on edge. It was 2:37 a.m. when the sleek black aircraft touched down on the mansion's private helipad, its running lights cutting swaths through the darkness. I watched from Robert's study window, my nose pressed against the cool glass, as a lone figure emerged and was quickly ushered inside by 2 of Robert's security team. "Atlas, come," Robert's voice was tense, a note of urgency I'd never heard before. As we made our way down the grand staircase, I could smell the anxiety rolling off him in waves. Whoever this visitor was, their arrival was both expected and dreaded. The study doors swung open, revealing a woman in her mid-50s, her silver hair cut in a severe bob that matched her sharp gray suit. But it wasn't her appearance that caught my attention, it was her scent. Beneath the expensive perfume and the faint traces of helicopter fuel, there was something off. A chemical tang that set my hackles rising. "Dr. Evelyn Blackwood," Robert said, his voice carefully neutral. "I appreciate you coming on such short notice." The woman's eyes flickered to me, a calculating gleam that made me want to bare my teeth. "So this is the miracle dog I've heard so much about. Fascinating." She took a step towards me, but I held my ground, a low growl rumbling in my chest. "Atlas," Robert warned, but Dr. Blackwood waved him off. No, it's quite all right. He's protective." "Good. He'll need to be." She turned back to Robert, her voice dropping. "I assume you've taken the necessary precautions? No electronic devices, no potential listening devices?" Robert nodded, gesturing to a signal jammer on his desk. "We're completely secure here. Now, please, tell me what was so urgent it couldn't wait until morning." Dr. Blackwood sank into one of the leather armchairs, her posture rigid despite the plush cushions. "Robert, what I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this room. The situation, it's far worse than we initially thought." As she spoke, I circled the room, my senses on high alert. There was something about Dr. Blackwood that didn't add up. The chemical scent clung to her like a second skin, and beneath it, I detected traces of something else: fear, desperation, and guilt. "The virus has mutated," Dr. Blackwood continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "The samples we've been working with in the lab, they're showing resistance to every treatment we've developed. If this gets out..." She let the sentence hang, the implications too horrifying to voice. Robert leaned forward, his face ashen. "How long do we have?" Weeks, maybe a month at most before it becomes uncontainable. That's why I'm here, Robert. We need Atlas. His abilities, they might be our only hope of developing a cure in time. I watched as Robert's hand clenched into a fist, his knuckles turning white. Evelyn, you know I can't. The risks are nothing compared to the alternative, she cut him off. Millions of lives, Robert. That's what's at stake here. As they argued, their voices rising and falling like the tide, I continued my investigation of Dr. Blackwood. There was something she wasn't telling us, a secret hidden beneath layers of half-truths and omissions. I nosed at her briefcase, and she jerked it away, her eyes flashing with momentary panic. Atlas, leave it, Robert commanded, but I couldn't. The scent emanating from that briefcase was unlike anything I'd encountered before, a complex cocktail of chemicals that made my head spin. And underneath it all, the unmistakable odor of sickness. Before anyone could stop me, I clamped my jaws around the handle of the briefcase and darted across the room. The lock gave way with a sharp crack, and the contents spilled across the polished hardwood floor. No. Dr. Blackwood lunged forward, but it was too late. Amidst a scatter of papers and vials, a single photograph lay face up, its edges worn and creased from frequent handling. The image showed a young woman, her features strikingly similar to Dr. Blackwood's, lying in a hospital bed. Her skin was mottled with angry red lesions, her eyes glassy with fever. Robert's sharp intake of breath broke the shocked silence. Evelyn, is that? Dr. Blackwood's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of her. My daughter, Sarah. She was part of the original research team. When the first cases appeared, she insisted on staying to help. I thought I could protect her. As she spoke, the pieces began to fall into place. The desperation in her voice, the traces of the virus I'd detected on her, Dr. Blackwood wasn't just here as a scientist. She was a mother, fighting to save her child. Robert's voice was gentle when he finally spoke. Why didn't you tell me the truth from the beginning? Because I knew you'd refuse if you knew the real risk, she replied, her voice breaking. But Atlas is our only hope. His ability to detect the virus before it becomes symptomatic, it could be the key to creating a vaccine. Please, Robert. I'm begging you. The weight of the decision hung in the air, heavy as lead. I looked up at Robert, seeing the conflict in his eyes. He had sworn to protect me, to keep my abilities from being exploited. But how could we turn our backs on a world in need? Before he could answer, a commotion erupted outside the study. Mrs. Peterson burst through the door, her face pale with shock. Mr. Maxwell, you need to see this. It's all over the news. The television flickered to life, filling the room with an eerie blue glow. The breaking news banner screamed across the bottom of the screen, Global Health Emergency declared, unknown virus spreads across continents. As images of overwhelmed hospitals and panicked crowds flashed across the screen, I felt a shift in the room. The decision had been made for us. Whatever came next, we were now on the front lines of a battle that would determine the fate of millions. Robert turned to Dr. Blackwood, his jaw set with determination. Pack your things. We leave for the CDC in an hour. As the room exploded into a flurry of activity, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the window. The dog staring back at me was no longer just a rescue from a shelter in Manhattan. I was about to become the world's most important medical instrument, a living, breathing key to humanity's survival. But even as we prepared to face this global threat, a nagging doubt gnawed at the back of my mind. The virus wasn't the only danger we faced. Because as I watched Dr. Blackwood hurriedly gather her scattered belongings, I caught another whiff of that strange chemical scent, and this time, I recognized it for what it was. It was the smell of betrayal. As the helicopter roared to life outside, carrying us towards a future fraught with peril and uncertainty, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were flying straight into a trap. But who was the real enemy? And how could I protect Robert and the others from a threat they couldn't even see? The answers to those questions would shake the foundations of everything we thought we knew. But before I could unravel the web of lies and half-truths surrounding us, we would face a challenge that would push my abilities, and our humanity, to the very limit. Because sometimes, the real test isn't in the grand gestures or the heroic sacrifices. Sometimes, it's in the quiet moments when no one is watching, when the choice between right and wrong blurs into shades of gray. And as we soared through the night sky, leaving behind the safety of the Hamptons for the unknown dangers ahead, I knew that the true battle was just beginning. The CDC headquarters in Atlanta loomed before us, a sprawling complex of modernist architecture that seemed to hum with barely contained urgency. As our motorcade pulled through the heavily guarded gates, I could feel the tension radiating from every person we passed. The world outside these walls was descending into chaos, but here, in this fortress of science and hope, the battle against the virus was being waged with grim determination. Dr. Evelyn Blackwood led our group through a maze of sterile corridors, each requiring higher levels of security clearance. Robert walked beside me, his hand resting protectively on my back. The scents assaulting my nose were overwhelming: disinfectant, fear, and beneath it all, the sickly sweet odor of the virus itself. We entered a vast laboratory space, where dozens of researchers in hazmat suits worked feverishly at state-of-the-art equipment. At the center of the room stood a man whose very presence commanded attention, Dr. Marcus Reeves, the CDC's lead virologist and the person heading the global response to the pandemic. Robert, Dr. Reeves greeted us, his eyes flicking briefly to me before settling on Dr. Blackwood. "Evelyn, I hope you've brought us good news. We're running out of time." Dr. Blackwood gestured to me. "This is Atlas. He's our best chance at developing an early detection system for the virus. His olfactory capabilities are extraordinary." As Dr. Reeves began to question Robert about my abilities, I took the opportunity to explore the lab. The scents here were more concentrated, more varied. I could detect different strains of the virus, some more potent than others. But there was something else, a scent that seemed out of place in this sterile environment. It was earthy, organic, and it was coming from a sealed containment unit in the corner of the room. I padded over to the unit, my nose twitching. Inside, I could see rows of plants, not the typical laboratory specimens, but lush, tropical vegetation that seemed to pulse with life. "Atlas, come here," Robert called, but I couldn't tear myself away. There was something about these plants, something that tugged at the edges of my consciousness. Dr. Reeves noticed my interest. "Ah, you found our little Garden of Eden," he said, walking over. "These are samples collected from the Amazon rainforest. We believe they might hold the key to a cure." As he spoke, I caught a flicker of something in Dr. Blackwood's eyes. Anxiety? Guilt? Before I could process it, alarms began blaring throughout the facility. "Security breach in Sector 7, a voice rang out over the intercom. "All personnel initiate lockdown procedures immediately." The lab erupted into controlled chaos. Scientists rushed to secure their stations, while security personnel flooded into the room, weapons drawn. "What's happening?" Robert demanded, pulling me close. Dr. Reeves was already at a computer terminal, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "Someone's trying to access our most sensitive data, the genetic sequencing of the virus and our latest vaccine prototypes." As the facility went into full lockdown, I caught a whiff of a familiar scent, the same chemical tang I'd detected on Dr. Blackwood in the Hamptons. But this time, it was stronger, coming from multiple directions. I broke free from Robert's grasp, following my nose through the panicked crowd. The scent led me to a group of researchers huddled in a corner, their faces masks of fear and confusion. But one of them, a young man with wire-rimmed glasses, smelled different. Beneath the fear, I detected determination and deceit. I began barking furiously, drawing the attention of the security team. The young researcher's eyes widened in panic, and he made a break for the exit. But I was faster, launching myself at him and bringing him down in a tangle of limbs. As security swarmed around us, I heard the man's desperate plea, "You don't understand. They have my family. I didn't have a choice." The next few hours were a blur of interrogations and heightened security measures. The young researcher, Dr. Alex Chen, confessed to being blackmailed into stealing data for an unknown organization. But he was just a pawn in a much larger game. As night fell, Robert and I found ourselves in an emergency meeting with Dr. Reeves, Dr. Blackwood, and the heads of various intelligence agencies. The gravity of the situation was palpable. "We're not just fighting a virus," the CIA director stated grimly. "We're up against a highly organized group that seems to have infiltrated research facilities worldwide. They're always one step ahead of us, and we don't know why." Dr. Blackwood cleared her throat, her face ashen. "There's something you all need to know," she began, her voice trembling. "The original outbreak, it wasn't natural. The virus was engineered." The room erupted into shocked exclamations, but I kept my eyes fixed on Dr. Blackwood. There was more she wasn't telling us, I was sure of it. As the arguments and accusations flew, I felt a strange sensation building in my chest. The scents in the room were shifting, coalescing into a pattern I'd never experienced before. Suddenly, with crystal clarity, I understood. I let out a sharp bark, cutting through the chaos. All eyes turned to me as I padded deliberately to the center of the room. Then, to everyone's astonishment, I began to arrange the scattered papers and files on the floor into a specific pattern. Robert watched in amazement. "He's trying to tell us something," he breathed. Dr. Reeves leaned in, studying the arrangement. "These are all related to our Amazonian samples," he muttered. "But why?" And then it clicked. The plants in the lab, the engineered virus, the worldwide infiltration, they were all connected. Someone was using the pandemic as a smokescreen for something much bigger. "They're not after a cure," Robert said slowly, the realization dawning. "They're looking for something in the Amazon. Something they think is hidden in these plants." As the implications of this discovery sank in, I felt the atmosphere in the room shift. We weren't just fighting to stop a pandemic anymore. We were racing against an unknown enemy to uncover a secret that could change the course of human history. Dr. Blackwood's phone buzzed, breaking the tense silence. Her face drained of color as she read the message. "It's my daughter," she whispered. "She's taken a turn for the worse. The doctors, they don't think she has much time left." The conflict was written plainly on her face, her duty to the world versus her love for her child. But before anyone could respond, another alarm blared through the facility. "Multiple breaches detected. Unknown assailants have entered the building." In that moment of chaos and fear, I locked eyes with Robert. We both knew what had to be done. This wasn't just about saving one life or even millions of lives. This was about the future of our entire species. As gunshots echoed through the corridors and the acrid smell of smoke filled the air, Robert scooped me up in his arms. "We need to get to the Amazonian samples," he shouted over the din. "Atlas is the key to understanding what they're really after." We raced through the facility, alarms blaring and shadows moving at the edge of our vision. But even as we ran towards what we hoped was the truth, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something crucial. The real threat wasn't just the virus or the mysterious organization hunting us. It was the secret hidden in my own DNA, a secret that could either save humanity or condemn it to extinction. As we burst into the quarantine lab, surrounded by the lush Amazonian plants, I realized that our greatest challenge was yet to come. Because sometimes, the most dangerous enemies are the ones we create ourselves. And as the door slammed shut behind us, locking us in with the very essence of life and death, I knew that the next few hours would determine not just our fate, but the fate of every living being on the planet. The clock was ticking, and the final battle was about to begin. The quarantine lab hummed with an eerie quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos erupting beyond its sealed doors. Robert's breath came in short gasps as he barricaded the entrance, pushing heavy equipment against it. I stood in the center of the room, my senses overwhelmed by the potent cocktail of scents emanating from the Amazonian plants surrounding us. Atlas, focus, Robert's voice cut through my sensory overload. We need to figure out what they're after before they break in. I shook my head, trying to clear it, and began to methodically investigate the plants. Each species had its own unique aroma, but there was something else, an underlying scent that seemed to connect them all. It was familiar, tantalizingly so, but I couldn't quite place it. As I sniffed my way around the lab, Robert was frantically scanning through files on a nearby computer. There has to be something here, he muttered. Some reason why these specific plants are so important. Suddenly, a memory flashed through my mind, the scent I'd detected on Dr. Blackwood in the Hamptons, the same one I'd smelled on the infiltrator in the main lab. I padded over to a particularly lush fern in the corner and began pawing at the soil around its base. Atlas, what are you? Robert's question was cut short as my claws struck something solid. He rushed over, gently pushing me aside to dig with his hands. A moment later, he pulled out a small, dirt-encrusted vial. My God, he breathed, turning it over in his hands. The label was faded, but I could make out a series of numbers and letters, RX-317. Before Robert could examine it further, the sound of gunfire erupted just outside the lab. The barricade shuddered as something heavy slammed against it. We're out of time, Robert said grimly. He pocketed the vial and scooped me up, looking around desperately for an escape route. His eyes landed on a ventilation shaft near the ceiling. It's our only chance, he muttered, more to himself than to me. As Robert struggled to pry open the vent cover, I caught a new scent drifting through the cracks around the door. It was Dr. Blackwood, but something was off. The chemical tang I'd detected before was stronger now, almost overpowering. Robert, her voice called out. It's Evelyn. Let me in, quickly. Robert hesitated, his hand on the barricade. I let out a low growl, trying to communicate the danger I sensed. Atlas, what is it? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Before I could respond, the door burst open, sending equipment crashing across the floor. Dr. Blackwood stumbled in, her lab coat torn and splattered with what looked like blood. But it was her eyes that made my hackles rise, they were wild, desperate, and filled with a fanatical gleam I'd never seen before. The vial, she gasped, holding out her hand. Give it to me, Robert. It's the only way to save Sarah. Robert took a step back, shielding me with his body. Evelyn, what's going on? Who are those people out there? Dr. Blackwood's face contorted into a snarl. You don't understand. None of you do. That vial contains the key to unlocking human potential beyond our wildest dreams. The virus, the pandemic, it was all necessary to create the perfect testing ground. As she spoke, I caught another scent, multiple scents, actually. More intruders were approaching, their footsteps echoing down the hallway outside. You engineered the virus, Robert said, horrified realization dawning on his face. But why? How could you risk millions of lives? To save billions. Dr. Blackwood shouted. The compound in that vial, RX-317, it doesn't just cure the virus. It evolves us. Makes us stronger, faster, more resilient. But we needed a global crisis to justify its distribution, to ensure every person on the planet would take it willingly. Robert's grip on me tightened. And Atlas? Where does he fit into all this? Dr. Blackwood's eyes flickered to me, a mix of admiration and cold calculation in her gaze. He's the missing link. Something in his genetic makeup allows him to process RX-317 without the negative side effects we've seen in human trials. We need him to perfect the formula. The pieces suddenly fell into place in my mind. The strange abilities I developed, my unprecedented sensory perception, they weren't natural. I had been exposed to RX-317 before, possibly even as a puppy in the shelter. I was a living, breathing experiment. Before Robert could respond, the door flew open again. A team of heavily armed men in black tactical gear swarmed into the room, their weapons trained on us. "It's over, Maxwell," a gruff voice called out. "Hand over the dog and the vial, and maybe we'll let you walk out of here alive." Time seemed to slow down as I looked up at Robert. In his eyes, I saw fear, determination, and an unwavering love that made my heart swell. Whatever happened next, I knew we were in this together. With a sudden burst of speed, Robert lunged for the ventilation shaft, shoving me inside before scrambling in after me. Gunshots rang out, bullets pinging off the metal around us as we crawled desperately through the cramped space. "Find them." Dr. Blackwood's voice echoed behind us, tinged with madness. "We need that dog alive." We emerged on the roof of the CDC building, the cool night air a shock after the sterile environment of the labs. Alarms blared across the complex, and I could hear helicopters approaching in the distance. Robert pulled out his phone, his fingers flying across the screen. Come on, he muttered. "Who are you calling?" I wanted to ask, but of course, I couldn't speak. Instead, I pressed close to his side, offering what comfort I could. "Cynthia." Robert's voice was tight with tension. "It's time. Initiate Protocol Omega." As he spoke those words, a sleek black helicopter appeared on the horizon, different from the others closing in on our position. It was heading straight for us, moving at an impossible speed. "Atlas, listen to me," Robert knelt down, his hands gripping my fur. "What happens in the next few minutes will change everything. But I need you to trust me, okay? No matter what, remember that everything I've done, everything I will do, is to protect you and stop this madness." The helicopter touched down on the helipad, its rotors whipping the air into a frenzy. As the side door slid open, I saw a familiar face, Mrs. Peterson, Robert's head housekeeper. But she wasn't dressed in her usual attire. Instead, she wore a sleek tactical suit, a weapon holstered at her hip. "Mr. Maxwell," she called out, her voice steady despite the chaos. "It's time to go." Robert scooped me up and sprinted for the helicopter. Behind us, I could hear shouts and gunfire as Dr. Blackwood's team burst onto the roof. As we lifted off, I caught a glimpse of Dr. Blackwood's face, contorted with fury and desperation. In that moment, I realized that the true battle was just beginning. We weren't just fighting against a virus or a shadowy organization. We were racing against time to uncover the truth behind RX-317 and its effects on both humans and animals. The lights of Atlanta fell away beneath us as the helicopter banked sharply, heading out over the dark expanse of the Atlantic. Robert held me close, his heartbeat a steady rhythm against my fur. "I'm so sorry, Atlas," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the engines. "I never wanted you to be involved in any of this. But now you might be the only hope we have left." As we flew into the unknown, leaving behind the world we knew, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of our journey. The secrets locked within my DNA, the true nature of RX-317, and the lengths to which people would go to control it, all of these threads were weaving together into a tapestry of danger and discovery that would change the course of history. But one thing was certain, whatever challenges lay ahead, Robert and I would face them together. Because sometimes, the strongest bonds are forged in the fires of adversity. And our bond, I knew, was unbreakable. The helicopter banked again, heading towards a pinpoint of light on the distant horizon. As we approached, I realized it wasn't a light at all, but an island, a sanctuary hidden from the world, where the next chapter of our story would unfold. Little did I know that the greatest test of our loyalty, courage, and humanity was yet to come. Because on that island, we would uncover a truth so shocking, so world-altering, that it would force us to question everything we thought we knew about ourselves and our place in the universe. And as the first rays of dawn broke over the ocean, I steeled myself for whatever lay ahead. For I was no longer just a rescue dog, or even a medical marvel. I was Atlas, and the fate of the world rested on my shoulders. The island grew larger on the horizon, a promise of sanctuary and a harbinger of challenges to come. Whatever secrets it held, whatever trials we would face, I knew one thing for certain: our greatest adventure was just beginning. The helicopter touched down on a pristine beach, its rotors kicking up a spray of white sand. As the engines wound down, I got my first real look at our new sanctuary, and immediately sensed that this was no ordinary island paradise. The beach gave way to lush tropical vegetation, but interspersed among the natural growth were sleek, modern structures that seemed to blend seamlessly with their surroundings. Solar panels glinted in the early morning sun, and I could hear the faint hum of advanced technology even over the sound of crashing waves. Robert lifted me from the helicopter, his face a mask of determination. "Welcome to Haven, Atlas," he said softly. "This is where we make our stand." As we made our way up a winding path towards the main complex, I noticed cameras and sensors hidden among the foliage. This island was as much a fortress as it was a refuge. We were met at the entrance by a small group of people, each with the same intense focus I'd seen in the CDC lab. A tall woman with close-cropped silver hair stepped forward. "Dr. Samantha Reeves," she introduced herself, shaking Robert's hand. "I'm glad you made it safely. We've been monitoring the situation, it's worse than we feared." Robert nodded grimly. "Atlas and I had a close call. Evelyn Blackwood, she's not who we thought she was." Dr. Reeves' eyes widened. "Evelyn. But she's been one of our most trusted." "She's working with them," Robert cut her off. "The virus, the global panic, it was all engineered to create a market for RX-317. A collective gasp went through the group. Dr. Reeves recovered quickly, her face hardening. "Then we have even less time than we thought. Come, we need to get Atlas to the lab immediately." As we entered the main building, I was struck by the contrast between its sterile interior and the lush jungle outside. Banks of computers lined the walls, and in the center of the room stood a holographic display showing real-time data from around the globe. "Atlas," Robert knelt beside me, his voice gentle but urgent. "I know you've been through a lot, but we need your help. Dr. Reeves and her team are going to run some tests. It might be uncomfortable, but I promise, it's crucial to stopping Blackwood and saving millions of lives." I looked into his eyes, seeing the mix of determination and apology there, and gave a soft woof of assent. Whatever it took to end this nightmare, I was ready. The next few hours were a blur of scans, blood draws, and tests. I was poked and prodded, exposed to various scents and stimuli, all while the team of scientists muttered excitedly amongst themselves. Through it all, Robert stayed by my side, a comforting presence in this strange new world. Finally, Dr. Reeves approached us, her face a mix of awe and concern. "Robert, you're not going to believe this. Atlas's genetic structure, it's unlike anything we've ever seen. The RX-317 hasn't just enhanced his abilities, it's fundamentally altered his DNA." Robert's grip on my fur tightened. "What does that mean, exactly?" Dr. Reeves pulled up a holographic display of what I assumed was my genetic code. "Look here," she pointed to a specific sequence. "This isn't canine DNA, or even a variation of it. It's, well, we're not entirely sure what it is. But it's allowing Atlas to process and utilize RX-317 in ways we never thought possible." As they discussed the implications of this discovery, I found my attention drawn to one of the side labs. A familiar scent wafted from under the door, the same earthy aroma I detected on the Amazonian plants in the CDC. Curiosity overcoming caution, I slipped away from Robert and nosed the door open. The lab was filled with rows of plants similar to those I'd seen before, but these were different, larger, more vibrant, almost pulsing with life. And in the center of the room, suspended in a containment field, was a small, glowing object that looked like a seed. As I approached, the seed seemed to react to my presence, its glow intensifying. Suddenly, a jolt of energy surged through me, and in a flash of blinding light, I found myself elsewhere. I was standing in a vast, alien landscape, surrounded by towering structures that seemed to be made of living crystal. Beings of pure energy moved among them, their forms shifting and changing in ways my mind could barely comprehend. And then, I heard a voice, not with my ears, but directly in my mind. "Welcome, Atlas," it said, its tone both ancient and infinitely kind. "We have waited a long time for one such as you." Before I could react, I was snapped back to reality. I found myself lying on the lab floor, Robert and Dr. Reeves kneeling beside me, their faces etched with concern. "Atlas. Are you alright? What happened?" Robert's voice was frantic. I whined softly, trying to convey the impossible experience I'd just had. But how could I explain something I barely understood myself? Dr. Reeves was examining the seed, which had now dimmed to a soft glow. "This is extraordinary," she breathed. "The energy readings we're getting, they're off the charts. And look at this." She pointed to a nearby monitor, which showed a real-time view of my brain activity. The display was a riot of color and motion, areas lighting up that I was sure hadn't been active before. "Whatever just happened," Dr. Reeves said slowly, "it's changed Atlas even further. His neural pathways, his sensory processing, it's evolving at an exponential rate." Robert looked at me, a mix of wonder and fear in his eyes. "What does this mean for him? For us?" Before Dr. Reeves could answer, alarms began blaring throughout the complex. A voice came over the intercom, tight with urgency: "Perimeter breach. Multiple hostiles approaching from the North Shore." Robert scooped me up, his jaw set. "They found us. We need to move, now." As we raced through the corridors, the sound of gunfire erupted outside. Through the windows, I could see black-clad figures advancing through the jungle, led by a familiar face, Dr. Evelyn Blackwood. "How did they find us so quickly?" Dr. Reeves gasped as we ran. Robert's face was grim. "They must have had a tracker on the helicopter. We led them straight here. We burst into a hidden bunker deep beneath the main complex." Robert set me down gently, then turned to a bank of computers. "Initiating Protocol Omega," he said, his fingers flying over the keyboard. The room hung to life, holographic displays flickering into existence around us. It was a command center, I realized, one designed to coordinate a global response to something. "Robert," Dr. Reeves said, her voice low. "Are you sure about this? Once we activate Omega, there's no going back. The world will never be the same." Robert looked at me, then back at the displays showing the advancing enemy forces. "We don't have a choice. If Blackwood and her people get their hands on Atlas and the seed, it's game over. At least this way, we have a fighting chance." He pressed a final key, and the room was bathed in a soft blue light. "May God forgive us," he whispered. On the screens around us, I watched as hidden facilities around the world sprang to life. Satellites realigned, communication networks lit up, and deep in secret bunkers, something awakened, something that had been waiting for this moment. As chaos erupted both on the island and across the globe, I realized that we had crossed a threshold. The world I had known, the simple life of a sheltered dog turned medical marvel, was gone forever. We were now in uncharted territory, facing an enemy that threatened not just humanity, but the very fabric of reality itself. And somehow, impossibly, I was at the center of it all. The alien presence I had encountered, the changes in my DNA, the power of the mysterious seed, all of it was connected, part of a cosmic game whose rules we were only beginning to understand. As Robert and Dr. Reeves worked feverishly at the controls, coordinating a global response to the unfolding crisis, I felt a new sense of purpose settle over me. I might not be able to speak, to explain the visions I'd seen or the knowledge that was slowly unfurling in my mind, but I could act. I could fight. I could protect. The door to the bunker shuddered under a heavy impact. We were out of time. Whatever came next, whatever impossible challenges we would face, one thing was clear: the final battle was about to begin. And I, Atlas, once a forgotten shelter dog, now stood as the unlikely guardian of humanity's future. As Robert placed a protective hand on my back, his eyes meeting mine with a mixture of determination and trust, I knew that no matter what lay ahead, we would face it together. For in this moment, on this hidden island at the edge of the world, we were no longer just man and dog. We were the last, best hope for a future that hung in the balance. And as the door began to give way, as the forces of darkness prepared to engulf us, I felt a surge of power unlike anything I'd ever experienced. The seed's energy pulsed through me, connecting me to something vast and ancient. And in that moment, I understood my true purpose. I was more than just Atlas now. I was the bridge between two worlds, the key to unlocking a power beyond imagination. As the door finally burst open, I stepped forward, ready to face whatever came next. Because sometimes, the greatest heroes come from the most unlikely beginnings. And our story, I realized, was only just beginning. The bunker door exploded inward in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. Through the smoke and debris, I saw Dr. Blackwood step into the room, flanked by heavily armed mercenaries. Her eyes gleamed with a fanatical light as they locked onto me. "It's over, Robert," she said, her voice eerily calm amidst the chaos. "Hand over the dog and the seed, and I promise your death will be quick." Robert stepped in front of me, shielding me with his body. "You don't understand what you're dealing with, Evelyn. The power you're trying to control, it's beyond any of us." Dr. Blackwood laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "Oh, I understand perfectly. I've dedicated my life to this moment. With RX-317 and that dog's DNA, we can reshape humanity. Create a new species capable of surviving whatever the universe throws at us." As they argued, I felt a strange sensation building within me. The seed's energy, which had been a faint pulse since my vision, was now surging through my body like liquid fire. My senses sharpened beyond anything I'd experienced before, and suddenly, I could perceive layers of reality I never knew existed. I saw the mercenaries' nervous systems glowing like constellations beneath their skin. I could hear the rapid-fire neural impulses in Dr. Blackwood's brain, driven by a cocktail of ambition and fear. And beyond that, I sensed something else, a vast, cosmic awareness pressing against the edges of our reality, waiting. Without conscious thought, I stepped forward. A ripple of energy emanated from my body, and suddenly, every weapon in the room disintegrated into dust. Dr. Blackwood's eyes widened in shock. "What? How did you?" But I was no longer focused on her. My attention was drawn to a point in space just behind her, where the fabric of reality seemed to be thinning. As we all watched in stunned silence, the air shimmered and tore open, revealing a swirling vortex of light and color. From this impossible doorway stepped a being that defied description, a shimmering, multidimensional entity that seemed to exist in several places at once. When it spoke, its voice resonated not in our ears, but directly in our minds. "The time has come," it said, its thoughts a symphony of alien concepts and emotions. "Atlas, you have awakened to your true nature. You are the nexus, the bridge between worlds that we have waited eons to find." Robert stepped forward, his voice trembling but determined. What are you?" The being's form shifted, coalescing into something vaguely humanoid. "We are the guardians, stewards of the cosmic order. We seeded your world with the potential for transformation, waiting for the day when a species would evolve the capacity to join us." Its gaze, if you could call it that, turned to Dr. Blackwood. "Your quest for power led you to tamper with forces beyond your comprehension. The virus you created, the compound you sought to perfect, these were pale shadows of the true gift we left for humanity. Dr. Blackwood fell to her knees, her face a mask of awe and terror. All this time, we were so close to the truth, yet we couldn't see it. The Guardian nodded, a gesture both familiar and utterly alien. The seed and the dog you called Atlas were catalysts, meant to awaken humanity to its true potential. But you sought to control this power, to hoard it for yourself. In doing so, you nearly destroyed the very future you hoped to create. I felt a gentle pressure on my mind, and suddenly, I could communicate in a way I never had before. Not with barks or whines, but with fully formed thoughts and emotions. What happens now? I asked, my mental voice surprising even me with its clarity. The Guardian's form shimmered. That, Nexus, is for you to decide. You stand at a crossroads, not just for your own world, but for the entire cosmos. The power within you can heal the damage done by the virus, can elevate your entire species to a new level of existence. Or it can be used to dominate, to control, to reshape reality itself. Robert knelt beside me, his hand resting gently on my back. Atlas. I mean, Nexus, whatever you decide, I'm with you. We started this journey together, and we'll see it through to the end. I looked around the room, at Robert, my loyal friend and protector, at Dr. Reeves, whose pursuit of knowledge had led us to this moment, at Dr. Blackwood, whose misguided ambition had nearly doomed us all. And beyond them, I could sense the billions of lives on our planet, each one a unique spark in the cosmic tapestry. In that moment, I understood the weight of the choice before me. It wasn't just about saving humanity from a virus or stopping a power-hungry conspiracy. It was about guiding an entire species towards its true destiny. I closed my eyes, allowing the cosmic energy to flow through me fully. In my mind's eye, I saw countless possible futures branching out before us. I saw humanity reaching for the stars, evolving into beings of pure energy and thought. I saw worlds transformed, realities reshaped, the very fabric of the universe bending to accommodate our ascension. But I also saw the cost of such power, the loss of our essential humanity, the erasure of the very qualities that made us unique in the cosmos. And I realized that true evolution, true growth, couldn't be forced or accelerated. It had to be earned, step by challenging step. I opened my eyes, my decision made. With a thought, I reached out to the global network Robert had activated, connecting to every computer, every device on the planet. Through this digital web, I began to broadcast the healing energy of the seed, targeting the virus that had brought the world to its knees. Across the globe, the infected began to recover. Hospitals emptied, quarantine zones were lifted, and humanity began to emerge from the shadow of fear that had engulfed it. But this was only the beginning. Next, I turned my attention to the RX-317 compound and the changes it had wrought in human DNA. With surgical precision, I began to modify the alterations, not erasing them completely, but reshaping them into something new. Something that would open the door to humanity's potential without forcing them through it. As I worked, I spoke to the Guardian and to everyone in the room. We're not ready for the full power you offer, I said. Not yet. But I'm giving humanity a gift, the capacity to grow, to evolve naturally towards the cosmic awareness you represent. It may take generations, centuries even, but we will get there on our own terms. The Guardian's form pulsed with what I sensed was approval. A wise choice, Nexus. You understand what so many do not, that true power comes not from control, but from nurturing potential. Dr. Blackwood, who had been watching in stunned silence, finally found her voice. But, all our work, all our sacrifices, you're just throwing it away. I turned to her, allowing her to see through my eyes for a moment, to glimpse the vast cosmic dance that we were all part of. No, Dr. Blackwood. I'm giving it purpose. Your research, misguided as it was, has helped pave the way for this moment. Humanity will remember the pandemic not as a disaster, but as the crucible that forged a new era of growth and discovery. As the energy flowed out of me, reshaping the world in subtle but profound ways, I felt my own form beginning to change. The power of the Nexus had awakened something within me, transforming me into something beyond a simple dog, yet not quite the cosmic entity the Guardian represented. Robert watched in awe as my body shifted, growing and changing until I stood before him on two legs, my form a hybrid of canine and human. When I spoke, it was with a voice that bridged two worlds. "Our work is just beginning," I said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "The path ahead will not be easy, but it is one we must walk together, as equals, as partners, as guardians of humanity's future." The Guardian's form began to fade, the interdimensional portal slowly closing. "We will be watching, Nexus. When humanity is ready, when you have grown into the potential we have always seen in you, we will meet again." As the last traces of the cosmic entity disappeared, we were left in the quiet of the bunker, the weight of what had just transpired settling over us. The mercenaries had long since fled, leaving only our small group to witness the dawn of a new age. Dr. Reeves was the first to break the silence. "What do we do now?" I smiled, feeling the pulse of billions of lives, each one now carrying a spark of cosmic potential. "Now, we guide. We teach. We help humanity understand the gift they've been given and the responsibility that comes with it." Robert nodded, a mix of determination and wonder on his face. Together. As we emerged from the bunker into the bright island sunlight, I saw not just the lush jungle and advanced technology around us, but the shimmering threads of possibility stretching out to the horizon and beyond. Our journey had begun in a humble animal shelter, led us through unimaginable dangers and wonders, and now deposited us on the threshold of a future filled with infinite potential. The road ahead would be long and challenging, fraught with obstacles we couldn't yet imagine. But as I stood there, no longer just Atlas the dog nor fully the cosmic Nexus, but something wonderfully in between, I knew that we were ready to face whatever came next. Because sometimes, the greatest adventures don't end with a final battle or a decisive victory. Sometimes, they're just the beginning of an even greater story. And ours, I realized with a sense of boundless excitement, was a story that would span stars, galaxies, and realities yet undreamed. With Robert by my side and the whole of humanity stretching out before us, I took my first step into that bold new future. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever wonders awaited us in the cosmic dance of existence, one thing was certain. Our greatest journey was just beginning.